We negate contention 1 is terrorism. Currently, the Middle Eastern terrorist group Hezbollah has turned to Venezuela. As Savage 19 further explains, that Maduro opened its doors to Hezbollah, giving them full access to Latin America in exchange for backing. As Venezuela serves as a key transit port and networking point for Venezuela's money laundering and illicit drug trafficking. Additionally, Venezuela is now their forward operating base to conduct attacks across the Western Hemisphere, and consequently, Savage finds that losing Venezuela would be a serious blow to Hezbollah. Fortunately, Newman in 2019 writes that because Hezbollah has moved money through the recently targeted PDVSA, U.S. sanctions on Venezuela have moved a secondary effect on Hezbollah's finances, impacting the salaries of their fighters and degrading their overall capacity. Thus, Hanif 19 concludes that due to U.S. sanctions, Hezbollah's stay in Venezuela is soon to be over, and critically, Singer 19 warns that Hezbollah poses a serious danger to the entire civilized world as its determined expansion could turn to the Western Hemisphere to the next terrorist battleground. Worryingly, Erlanger 17 writes that Hezbollah has been the threat to millions of lives in the Middle East alone, and that effect only carries over to the Western Hemisphere. Contention 2 is backing the oil curse. As back in the 1980s, Clark 19 finds that Venezuela was one of the most prosperous countries in South America. However, Rossi 11 finds that after Venezuela discovered the largest petroleum reserve in the world, oil grew to make up 98% of their exports, collapsing the agricultural and industrial manufacturing sectors that once made up the country's economic base. That's called the oil curse, and breaking free from it is the most important thing in this round. Rossi furthers that with minimal investment in other industries, Venezuela has become solely dependent on oil to import staple goods as they used to make themselves, meaning these shocks in the global market can easily push the poor into starvation and death. As a result, since Venezuela discovered their petroleum reserves, poverty increased eightfold and their economy declined 25%. Thankfully, Reposer writes in 2019 that U.S. sanctions have primarily targeted Venezuela's SOE oil firms, and companies can no longer loan money, trade bonds, or purchase oil from the petroleum conglomerate, which Reposer finds would decrease oil production to historically low levels. Thus, Mallet 17 concludes that U.S. economic pressures Venezuela now is resolved to end its dependence on oil. Results are starting to show, as Nitzberg 18 writes, that the solution to Venezuela's oil curse is diversification, allowing Venezuela to sustain their population by being less reliant on oil and imports and paving the way for development. Indeed, the CDO writes in 2019 that Venezuela has launched initiatives to diversify their economy, focusing on improving domestic production and non-oil exports, for example, increasing tourism and international investment, which would sustain their economy in the long term. That diversification is essential, as Kakanov writes in 2018 that every 1% decrease in share in oil exports causes a 0.7 increase in the growth of the entire economy. Without sanctions, Venezuela would remain an oil state, neglecting the growth that could help 26 million people currently living in poverty, which Ross concludes most states in the developing world have made significant progress over the past few decades, but Venezuela has not, and it's the same as it was since the 1980s. Contention 3 is military intervention. There's two actors that would militarily intervene in Venezuela if U.S. was to end sanctions. Subpoint A is Colombia. DeYoung writes in 2019 that in order to force out Maduro, he has moved to rising fears in military conflict between Venezuela and Colombia. Thankfully, there is an alt, as Sullivan in 2019 explains that Colombia's President Duque has called for sanctions in Venezuela, and they hope that Maduro would leave the office without violence. However, NPR finds that Santos, the Colombian ambassador to the U.S., insisted that there's still time for international pressure and sanctions to force out Maduro, but if that plan fails, a plan B would involve violence. Problematically, Toro writes that armed conflict is now real and terrifying, as tensions rising between Maduro and Colombia, and he would say he would deploy 150,000 troops to the border to combat Colombia. And the BBC terminalizes it for you, saying that past Latin American conflicts, including Colombia, killed over 200,000 people and displaced 5 million more. The subpoint B is U.S. As Axe writes in 2019 that Trump threatened a military intervention on Venezuela in 2018, but used sanctions as an alternative, as alt. As given sanctions are off the table, there's two reasons the U.S. would resort to military intervention. First is a re-election, as Grove 19 explains, that in order to win key swing state voters in Florida, Trump has to maintain his hardline stance on Venezuela to swing them. But second is preventing global control. As DSA found 3 days ago, the U.S. is looking to take action against Russia for their involvement with Venezuela, and but sanctions are the route they've chosen. But Polizia concludes that given sanctions are not the method of choice anymore, the U.S. would prepare for a military intervention. Additionally, the intervention has precedent, as they've already intervened in Latin America 56 times in the past. Tragically, Kim finds that a U.S. intervention in Venezuela would draw in regional actors, making it worse than the Vietnam War, which Kim finds had killed 4 million people already. Thus, we're proud to negate.
Is everyone ready? Guys ready?
Yeah.
Cool. We affirm contention 1 is mass starvation. Sanctions decimate oil revenues in 3 ways. First is choking sales. Reuters 19 finds that sanctions have prevented U.S. companies, previously the biggest customer for Venezuelan oil, from buying it. Second is preventing debt renegotiation. PDVSA, Venezuela's state-owned oil company, has a lot of debt. Because of this, the Washington Post finds in 2019 the oil it sells to major customers like China and Russia is only being used to pay off the debt without making any net profit. Fortunately, Wisepro 17 finds that Maduro prepared a restructuring plan that would have deferred billions of dollars in debt to be paid off later down the line. This renegotiation would let PDVSA profit from oil sales, allowing hard currency to flow into the economy and helping it pay back its debts later on. Unfortunately, Martin 19 concludes that by legally barring creditors from renegotiating their debt with Venezuela, U.S. sanctions have single-handedly prevented this restructuring. Third is freezing assets. Taylor 19 finds that Citgo, a Houston-based oil company owned by PDVSA, is a key moneymaker for Venezuela's oil industry, and Citgo profit is needed for any recovery. Unfortunately, Taylor concludes that because Citgo operates in the U.S. market under the 2019 sanctions, we will route any Citgo revenue into a blocked account, stopping it from reaching Venezuela. In fact, he finds that U.S. sanctions immediately froze $7 billion of Citgo assets and blocking an additional $11 billion of oil revenue in 2019. Fortunately, removing sanctions will allow PDVSA to immediately reclaim $18 billion in access future profits. For these reasons, sanctions have devastated the oil industry. Marketic 19 finds that while Venezuela's economy was not perfect before, U.S. sanctions kicked it off a cliff, noting that the 2017 sanctions plummeted oil revenues at over 3 times the rate of the preceding years. Oil revenues are going to drop an additional 67% this year, which is unprecedented. Indeed, TL19 finds that in the weeks following harsh new U.S. sanctions, oil production fell by 600,000 barrels a day to half the average of 2018. Thus, lifting sanctions will allow oil revenues to skyrocket. There are 3 reasons that increased oil revenues directly help the people. First, it's hard currency. Unfortunately, Rodriguez 18 finds that 95% of Venezuela's exports come from PDVSA, and without money from oil revenues, the economy lacks the hard currency to pay for food and medicine. Indeed, OPEC finds that a whopping 99% of Venezuela's economy is made of oil revenues. Second is food imports. Resback 18 finds that because Venezuela has shortages of food domestically, they make up for these shortages by paying for imports of food with oil revenues. Third is social programs. Taladrid 19 finds that Venezuela pays for social programs like food distribution programs through oil revenues, and that a decrease in oil revenues directly decreased the funding for these programs. For these reasons, their entire economy is dependent on oil. Heinz 19 concludes that all sectors of Venezuela's economy depend on oil revenues. For example, he finds that agricultural sector has plummeted 50% with food rotting in the fields because without oil revenues, they cannot pay for things like gasoline to fuel the trucks to take their crops to the market. Thus, Marquette concludes that virtually every basic necessity of Venezuelans' daily life, food, medicine, clean water, electricity, transportation, is funded through oil export revenue. The impact is famine. Vicebrook 19 finds that the impacts of U.S. sanctions disproportionately affect the most vulnerable, reducing caloric intake, increasing disease and mortality rates. CEPR concludes that in 1 year alone, U.S. sanctions killed over 40,000 Venezuelans. Ultimately, Heinz 19 finds that because of sanctions, a famine causing hundreds of thousands of deaths is going to break out in the next 12 months, but removing sanctions now will prevent it from worsening to this point, saving these hundreds of thousands of lives. Contention 2 is aid. Lion 19 finds that Maduro blocked all humanitarian aid from entering the country in 2019 in response to new U.S. sanctions. Fortunately, Lion concludes that Maduro's condition for allowing humanitarian aid back into Venezuela is the removal of U.S. sanctions. If you remove U.S. sanctions, Maduro lets in the aid. This is critical because UN News 19 finds that 25% of the population, 7 million citizens, need humanitarian aid to survive for food and water. On framing, probability comes before other way because 1, it doesn't matter if they have high magnitude impacts if they never happen, but 2, in order for debate to be educational, we should be emulating real policymakers who evaluate policies based on what they will do. If we evaluated magnitude first, we would never pass any policy because there's always a risk that any change can lead to extinction. We affirm. Yes. Okay.
I see sanctions are going to cause a famine.
Yeah.
Is famine the only impact of the first contention, the only time of that?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And starvation.
Can I also see the Westboro evidence that Maduro was planning a restructuring plan
Yep.
pre-sanctions?
I'll show you Wisebrook first.
Alright, that's fine.
Okay. This is Wisebrook. We cite this part of the
Where's the part that said that Venezuela was planning to do it?
That is the
When's the card from? Oh, 2017. Right, that's fine.
Yeah, and you want
Nice, yeah.
Cool.
Okay. let's start on the Wisebro evidence that you just showed me, right? The bolded part that you said, or it says two things. It says right now it would be a good idea to debt restructure, which wouldn't, like, okay, sorry. My question is, your evidence is from 2017, and it says that debt restructuring started in 2016. Isn't that post-2015 sanctions?
No, it's before 2017 sanctions.
But 2017 sanctions were the second round of sanctions. We're now on the
Right.
third round
The
of
2015
sanctions.
sanctions didn't really do anything, so the 2017 sanctions are the only ones that matter.
Okay, so, like, why did they collapse, though?
What? Why did what collapse?
This, like, the debt restructuring talks.
Because he didn't want to concede, he didn't want to negotiate.
Okay.
Was oil decreasing before sanctions were put in place?
Sure.
Okay, that's all.
Oh, okay. Okay, let's go to the bottom of your case, right, on social programs.
Yeah.
What food programs does, like, oil revenue, like, directly fund?
Well, like it's a socialist regime, right? So like all the food programs, like when the government has money, they put it into programs to feed the people. They
Okay, so,
request
like,
to feed them.
pre-sanctions, why was, like, 70% of the population already, like, dying from, like, caloric malnutrition?
Well, I would say that one, like, yes, the economy was bad before. Marquette concludes that, but he does frontline that by saying that after sanctions, revenues from oil decreased 3 times. But I have a question for you.
Okay.
Okay, you talk about military intervention.
Mhm.
What does the Colombia evidence from Santos actually say?
It says that the Colombian ambassador said that right now they want to use sanctions,
Yes.
but in a point where sanctions don't work.
No,
or
they
they're
don't say
removed.
sanctions. They say that in a point where international pressure is not being applied on Colombia,
But
Venezuela,
it's them
then
talking to
they're
the
going
US.
to use. Then there will be violence. One
Okay.
that says a few things. I think we need to get into this real
Okay,
quick.
go
That
ahead.
says a few things. I think one that says that international pressure, like that's always going to be on Venezuela. But two, I think that also says that like. It's not that they're going to use violence, it's just that there is going to be violence, which implies either a civil war or like other things happening, but not that Colombia is actually going to invade.
Okay, well, it's their plan B. They said their plan B involves
No,
violence.
we've read this evidence too, like we've tried running it before, but then we had to scrap it because it doesn't work.
Okay.
Okay,
Uh,
you can have a question.
Alright, let's go to this hard currency drop off, right? Actually, no, let's go to aid.
Okay.
So does Maduro allow aid into the country and then just allow those aid distributions to like distribute the aid,
he doesn't.
or like does he
doesn't
distribute
allow
the aid
anything
himself?
right now. Right now, we tell
I mean,
him that he's.
pre-sanctions.
Oh, pre-sanctions.
Yes.
I don't think it matters pre-sanctions.
Then okay, so like if we allow aid in, do we just go back to the level we were pre-sanctions, where the economy is still tanked and like 90% of the population was in poverty?
No, but I would also say that on probability, we still have 100% solvency, 100% probability that 7 million people get the aid that is going to come into the economy, like, because that's 100%.
Sure, but they just go to pre-sanction levels. It's a drop in the bucket. People, like 90% of the population is still
Like, I think
in
you still
crippling
have to
poverty.
win economic reform to win any of that.
Yeah, so the
Okay, cool.
Okay. Alright, we're just gonna take Minecraft.
Okay, also one more case. You have to respond to their, they had to I don't know yet. This is the most important. Oh, I should have asked a question. It's like, it was, did I get it? Yeah.
Okay, so that's 145.
Yeah. It's just gonna be, right down. Right down. Everybody ready? Start start on their first contention. First, some overall responses. Delinquent Morales 19 finds that sanctions are not to blame for the Venezuelan crisis, as there's a lack of public data to realistically estimate the causal effect. What's clear is that the bulk of deterioration happened prior to the 2017 sanctions, so it's indistinguishable, which means that you don't grant them 100% solvency. Second, Turnet, as Redden 19 finds that the Venezuelan crisis was actually caused by Maduro siphoning money from social programs, which is their impact, and neglecting millions, restricting their access to food and medicine. Sanctions uniquely choke off Maduro's illegitimate earnings and weaken his grasp on power. Brown finds that because of his choking off of revenues, he can no longer pay the military, which Tian finds is the one who decides who stays in power, which means that the longer that the military does not receive any funds from Maduro, the more likely it is that Maduro gets out of power. That means that we're actually solving for the root cause of Venezuela's problems, which is Maduro neglecting social programs. But you can also delink it overall, as Dobson 18 indicates that in order to overcome sanctions, Venezuela joined the BRI. Critically, Rune 19 finds that through the increasing connectivity, the BRI is set to increase trade by almost 10%, and Levano in June writes that trade has increased trade between China and Latin America countries by 20-fold. On their first one about choking sales, they don't tell you the full story. Eleanor 19 identifies 3 alt causes for a plummet in oil revenue that happened before sanctions were in place. First, the failure to diversify production and cut dependency on petroleum fueled a crash in oil prices. That is our second contention solvency. Second, the implementation of policies that discourage private investment. Third, the mismanagement of nationalized oil companies under the Maduro administration. They need to prove to you that lifting sanctions solves back for those other 3 alt causes. But also, I would say that at the point where we get rid of Maduro, we're solving back for those same reasons, which means that we're solving for their case. On the second warrant about preventing debt renegotiation, Hester 19 finds that Maduro is the main reason why Venezuela can't restructure its debt, because bond traders believe that servicing its massive debt will become the biggest sovereign debt mess, and Maduro's legacy of loan defaults would hurt them by destroying their credit and threaten their future capacity to issue debt relief. That's why they just do not want to work with Maduro. And Aftab 19 corroborates this when he finds that the main committee that holds Venezuelan debt now criticizes Maduro's debt restructuring plans because they prevent investors from seizing assets in the first place. Thus, there would be zero enforcement on collecting future debt. I also call for their restructuring evidence. The problem is that it comes before sanctions were in place, which means that even when the sanctions were not on Venezuela, Maduro still failed at renegotiating the debt, which means that they have no solvency here. On their third warrant about freezing assets, massive turn here. Barnstein in October finds that the U.S. used sanctions to prolong a debt payment for Venezuela over Citgo to Russia. Otherwise, Citgo would have been taken over by Russian-owned Rosneft. Lindenberg furthers that if Russia were to gain control over Citgo, they would also have control over domestic U.S. oil prices by obtaining a huge amount of U.S. oil assets that could spike prices. Thomas 19 concludes that any threat to oil price stability in the U.S. could cause a recession, as every major economic downturn in the U.S. for the past 5 decades was triggered by a significant rise in energy prices. Crucially, the IMF finds that the next economic shock could push 900 million people into poverty. Thus, it also acts as terminal defense at the point where lifting sanctions allows for Russia to claim their collateral and take control over Citgo. Citgo is not getting any money from Citgo in the first place. They have no links to their impact. But on the impact level on famine, they tell you 40,000 deaths have happened because of sanctions. The problem is their studies methodology is really bad. Mahar 19 finds that it's impossible to isolate sanctions as the root cause of deaths, and the study fails to address the deterioration that happened long before sanctions were even announced. He concludes that the omission of these trends make it impossible to attribute sanctions at the main issue, but also at the point where we're solving for Maduro getting kicked out of office, we're solving for the underlying issues that caused those 40,000 deaths in the first place. On their second contention, dealing them as Raposa 19 finds that the only aid that's blocked by the U.S. is aid that goes for sanctioned individuals, not the general public. Additionally, Silk finds that the OFAC issued licenses that authorize critical transactions into Venezuela that deliver food, medicine, and remittances, which legally bypass sanctions. You can also non-unique it as Mahar finds that imports like medicine and food were already down by 71% before sanctions. And also, PBS writes that the U.S. has sanctioned political officials, this is a term, preventing aid from going into Venezuela. As a result, Al Jazeera 19 finds that Maduro has recently allowed for significant amounts of Red Cross aid to pass. The New Yorker furthers that the U.S. has already been able to send millions of dollars in aid in light of a request from Guaido. This is at worst and not unique because the U.S. is simply giving back the medicine and aid that the access that they took away, but at best a turn because U.S. sanctions are the only way that the country has access to medicine, because otherwise Maduro would block everything else.
My computer just died, so I'm just going to open the document if that's fine.
His computer died.
You can connect to my hotspot. Hold on.
I have a charger too. But I'm just going to use Esme's computer while I wait for it to charge. Sorry for the inconvenience. I need the, you know what document I'm looking for?
No, I have no idea. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
it's going to be frontlining our case, and then down their case. Is everyone ready?
Wait, real quick, please stop. I take 2 seconds.
Sure.
Cool, that was 2 seconds.
Okay. So their first response to the deal, they say that sanctions are not the root cause. We're not advocating that sanctions are the root cause of the humanitarian crisis. Our impact scenario is the famine. They don't isolate for that. Marshall says anyway that even if the economy was bad before, sanctions push it off a cliff. That's where our solvency comes from. Then they say a turn that Maduro stops from social programs and they push out Maduro. But they concede Taladrid from our internal links that says that Maduro was spending all oil revenue on social programs before you increase oil revenue, increase social programs. But also we would say that they don't actually oust Maduro insofar as Reuters finds that the military is still loyal to Maduro. They're not changing anything, and also the military is ideologically aligned with Maduro according to Strike 19. So even if they do take over Maduro, they're just going to further his same policies. They get no solvency. But then their third turn is that this BRI, they read absolutely no terminal impact. You can't evaluate it. They don't weigh it or anything like that. But then we're not going to go for. Then they read a whole bunch of all clauses to our first link. None of them apply to our third link. Our third link, we're going for our third link. It specifically isolates for this $18 billion of revenue that Citgo is losing right now because of sanctions that immediately get injected into the oil industry if you lift sanctions. They read a big turn that says that sanctions protect Citgo. This is not true. First terminal defense. Reuters 19 finds that their protection started August 6th, and their evidence says that it only lasted 90 days. The protections are literally over. But second of all, you can turn it because PDVSA owns Citgo. The only reason they were at any risk of default is because PDVSA was selling a whole bunch of loans with Citgo as collateral. The only reason they were at risk of defaulting on those loans with Citgo as collateral is because we were sanctioning them. If we were not sanctioning PDVSA, they have no risk of defaulting on Citgo. That means you can actually turn their turn back toward us. But then they never respond to the internal links, so you know that increasing oil revenue goes to the people, and they never respond to Heinz, which says that the only way to stop the famine killing hundreds of thousands is to lift sanctions. On the turn on aid, it's not because of sanctions, and it's also the Red Cross aid is not enough. They read no impact on it. But then on their case, on terrorism, first their evidence literally says that the title of their evidence is how Hezbollah avoids sanctions. Sanctions don't solve because that's why they don't have no quantification of solvency. But second of all, they never tell you how much funding is uniquely from Maduro. Other actors in Latin America can also fund. For example, Iran can fund as well. LA Times finds yesterday that Hezbollah's main base in Latin America is Argentina, not Venezuela. But then they have no impact. University of Michigan literally finds that terrorism in Venezuela straight up killed 9 people in 2016. We easily outweigh the hundreds of thousands of deaths outweigh. But then on bringing the oil curse, first of all, if it's a good policy to diversify away from oil, Maduro's going to do it even if you lift sanctions. There's no reason that he's going to stop diversifying if you lift sanctions. But second of all of their link evidence they concede says that sanctions cause reforms because they cause the economy to decline. They concede themselves. The mismanagement was causing oil revenues to decline a little bit before sanctions. This gives us their solvency. They tell you that Maduro's mismanagement was causing oil to fall before anyways. This triggers their link. It means diversification is terminally not unique. They give us their solvency because the difference is that in a world without sanctions, this diversification will be gradual and under Venezuela's own terms. This means, but also it means that if their impact happens and the economy improves, their links short circuit. It means that the bad policies will be reimposed. They will stop diversification and the economy will crash back down, meaning they have zero long-term offense. But then this is a turn. Sanctions are too sudden to allow gradual diversification. The entire economy is dependent on oil right now. Taking the oil tanks every industry that they could possibly diversify into. Heinz 19 finds that sanctions have reduced the amount of oil revenues needed for purchasing imports, which is why he finds that since sanctions, imports of machine parts, trucks, diesel fuel, gasoline, electricity parts, food and medicines have fallen 60%, and sectors like agriculture have fallen 50%. They can't diversify into things because they're still dependent on oil. It's too sudden. But then they have no context how much is diversification happening, how much is the economy improving, but we still outweigh on urgency because even if the economy improves gradually over time, it doesn't stop the famine coming in the next 12 months. Only we do. But then on military intervention, first, it is an independent reason the sanctions calls for war. Pre-year 19 finds that Maduro stopped and negotiate with the opposition because of sanctions, which is why Alexander 19 finds that Venezuela is hurtling towards civil war, which would force most of these actors to intervene. But even if civil war isn't happening, Rodriguez 19 finds that Maduro is becoming more ruthless and repressive, which also independently justifies intervention because of sanctions triggers their links. But on Colombia, their evidence is really bad. It's just talking about violence in general. It's not Colombian violence, but also Colombia literally can't intervene. Wola 19 finds that the Colombian army is facing paralysis of military forces. But then on the U.S., Kwong 19 finds that Congress doesn't support intervention, which is why Lord 20 finds that Congress is enforcing war powers from Trump. So even if intervention happens, it's only going to be 30 days and they literally have no impact. Yep.
Can you explain to me how you get solvency off of our second?
Yeah, so what your partner can, so your own evidence says the reason that sanctions force Maduro to diversify away from oil is because they hurt the economy, they hurt the oil sector. So your own partner in Cross, and a lot of your evidence also concedes that the oil was being hurt by Maduro. That means that by your own link evidence, by your own warranting, because the oil was already being hurt, that means that diversification was going to happen either way. He was going to be forced to diversify. The difference is that diversification would have been on their own terms. It would have been gradual diversification, but sanctions are too sudden to allow any of that diversification to happen because everything is currently spent on oil.
Happening now?
What?
Like, if that's true, then why is diversification happening?
It's not happening.
Yeah,
You read no evidence that diversification is successfully happening.
That's our CDO evidence, but also
What does it say?
It says that like Venezuela has now implemented diversification.
And has it been successful?
Also, Brown.
How much?
Like,
has it been like how
sure,
much success? How much has the
Brown
economy
finds
improved?
that like Venezuela's economy is set to grow by 4% next year. So,
Okay,
like,
that's
at that point,
predictive. It's also not because of diversification. That warranting is not in that card. But
of course
additionally,
it's predictive. It's set to increase by that.
which is
I'm not
predictive. And you also
why
drop
is
the
that a bad
probability framing that status quo evidence is better than
probability
predictive.
is pretty high, I'd say. especially
No,
when
it's just a
first in line
predictive. It's just an
potential.
analyst saying it might grow. But what we're saying is that
Well, all of your evidence is predictive about whether or not sanctions causes like your impacts to be
okay,
solved.
sure.
Your evidence
But
doesn't like distinguish
here's the thing, though,
between
right?
what sanctions did and what they didn't. So at that point, how do we really know what lifting?
your
sanctions
evidence
was?
that says the diversification is happening right now does
That's a
not
sanction.
actually say how successful it is. You should prefer our Heinz evidence because we give you a warrant for it. We tell you that literally 99% of the economy is dependent on oil right now.
Which is
Obviously,
bad.
if you crush oil, you crush everything.
Yeah. Which we say is causing diversification, which is a good thing.
No,
because in the
no.
long term, at the
Okay.
point where you get rid of the
So-
root cause of like causing economic
Here's the thing, Cooper.
instability in Venezuela,
Here's the thing, Cooper.
then you solve for like all the stuff that's happening right now exponentially more in the future. Because what you end up seeing is that more and more recessions happen because their economy
So-
is literally just all oil.
You're still losing this argument because what you don't understand is that the diversification that is happening right now is
Yeah.
too sudden.
Okay, so
That's-
why is sudden diversification bad?
because that's why all of these sectors they're trying to diversify into are destroyed. The
That doesn't make any
agricultural sector,
sense.
for example, declined 50% since the last round of sanctions because their food is rotting in their fields because they can't, they need oil revenues to afford the trucks to bring it to market.
Like those industries barely existed before.
No, it's
sanctions.
all of the other
The
industries.
problem is now Maduro is being forced to pump money into those industries.
How much money is going to the industries?
A lot.
You have no internal link evidence. That is not, you're just saying a lot.
Yeah, that's fine. You know,
It is fun. Okay, sure. Do you have a question?
I said you can have one.
I'm sorry, I was an asshole. I'm sorry.
I did. I'm just trying to up. Oh, actually, can I see the Heinz evidence or Hayes evidence that says
Which?
The one about
Yeah, okay, the new
one that
Heinz.
you brought up, fast diversification?
Yeah, yeah. So let me pull up the new part we read.
Okay. I'm just take rep.
Okay, cool. It won't be long.
Right.
Yeah, here it is.
Okay.
So it's this whole thing, but this is the 60% decrease in the force. This is 50% agriculture.
Okay. Where does it say fast diversification though?
That's our analysis. It's all of the other evidence we read
Gotcha.
to, like OPEC, 99% dependent on oil.
That's fine. Alright, so the order is just gonna be down the neck, down the app. Is everyone good? So to the top of their second contention, they read 3 responses that diversification would happen in either world because they assume our link is just losing oil revenues. Losing oil revenues are a uniqueness. The link is that diversification is forced because the Maduro regime can no longer double down on oil. The issue with that is that all their turns are like focused on saying that diversification happens too fast, but the Haynes evidence that they show us doesn't say diversification at all. Even if they win that impact, the short-term implication of it is that they're a drop in the bucket. They still conceded in first cross and a rebuttal that like the majority of the population was already in poverty, so they're just going back to pre-sanction levels. They're just a drop in the bucket. That's why you always pull the trigger for us, because it's a much shorter gap to reach. The proposed evidence is really key. It tells you these sanctions target SOEs, which means they have no ability to loan or purchase oil, and the projection goes down to historic lows. That's really key. Because the Nitzenberg and Mallet evidence tell you that we're diversifying now, and it's working because we're predicted to grow by 4%. They say you weigh probability first, but realize their entire case is based upon predictive measures, so you don't down us for that reason. But the CDO evidence tells you that those initiatives are happening right now. It's diversifying the economy, and it's doing good things because the Kakanoff evidence that goes conceded tells you that every 1% decrease in oil shares grows the economy by 0.7%. That goes non-contested is the cleanest place to vote. But even if you don't, the Ross evidence tells you that would raise 26 million people out of poverty in the next few years. Then go down to the subpoint beyond U.S. intervention. They say that Congress will block it and there's only 30 days. But the only reason Congress would block it is because they see that they were right, that there's bad impacts to it. But that would mean that our impacts are already triggered, which means they functionally concede the contention, and that's already happened. Even if it's a short scale, the probability is really high because we already know that Trump's a war hawk and aggressive. That's Puglisi evidence that tells you that military is the alternative to the sanctions, which means that you're already conceding impacts, which triggers the Kim evidence, which tells you that intervention leads to the level of the Vietnam War, which killed 4 million people. But even if you don't believe that, they're losing their case. Go to the Maduro advantage that Cooper reads you at the top. All they say to it is that Maduro doesn't have the support of the troops, but the Tian evidence is really specific. I just call all of it, just you should call for it. It literally just says the military is abandoning him, and he only has a few months left. That means that sure, they might win short term, the military still supports him, and he's not falling from power tomorrow, but in a couple of months he will, which means that we solve for the root cause of poverty because they dropped the turn at the bottom. That tells you that even if they win their entire case, they just go back to the level of pre-sanctions where 70% of the population was dying from malnutrition. At that point, social programs aren't working because they didn't work pre-sanctions. The Rendon evidence is really specific. It tells you social programs were only used to fund the inner circle. They weren't used to fund the majority of the population, which means the majority of the population was still in poverty. That means we also link it to the probability framework because it happened in the past, which means the clarity on our side always flows towards us. But let's go to the bottom of the case. On the Russia turn, they say that this extension only lasted for 90 days, but the depth extension on the Lindbergh evidence is really clear. It tells you even that the depth extension was really short, it allowed a debt repayment period to the U.S. for a much longer time. But even if you don't believe that, the impact to the United States still exists because it tells you that if they gain control and if Russia were able to collect on that collateral, they didn't have to, but they had the opportunity to. But they didn't because sanctions were in place. But if they did collect on the collateral without sanctions, they would have been able to control the U.S. economy and had energy dependence, which would allow them to control shocks in the United States. They dropped the IMF evidence, which tells you that would have triggered a 900 million people recession. It's a clear advantage for us. It goes barely touched for them. But even if you don't believe that, they drop a lot of terminal defense at the bottom with the OFAC license from Self that tells you that if countries actually wanted to trade or business wanted to put in aid, they would just buy an OFAC license in the United States, which allows them to fund aid into Venezuela, meaning that sanctions have literally no impact because there's literally a fishing license to put in your imports.
Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of prep time, if that's okay. Starting now. Okay. So if sanctions are lifted, they will come against That's 156. Sorry. The order is gonna be. It's gonna be oil costs, military intervention, humanitarian crisis. Yeah. Cool. Everyone ready? Wait, actually, 2 seconds. What do you mean? Yeah. Yeah. I have that. Okay, that's 7.
That was 8 more seconds.
8 seconds. Sorry. Yeah. There. Okay. Starting on the oil costs. They tell us it's not their link that the oil is going. The reason diversification happens is because the oil industry is hurt. It literally is. All of their link evidence and all of the reasons that diversification happened in the first place was because the oil industry was put under pressure. That's really important because that link is triggered in either world. Their own evidence concedes that the oil industry was hurt before sanctions were even put in place. At that point, we would trigger diversification as well. That's really important because gradual diversification is far better. They never actually answer the warranting of this. We say that gradual diversification is better because 99% of these industries rely, like 99% of the money comes from oil revenue. That's really important because if these other industries rely so heavily on the oil industry that it's failing right now, they literally cannot diversify under their world, which is why the uniqueness is on our side. On probability, we outweigh really strongly, with 60% of agricultural things are failing in the rotten crops in the fields right now, and 50% of the other industries are declining by 50%. That's really important because they have literally no quantification. The only thing they can give us is this 4% thing, but one, this is literally not linked directly to diversification. Call for their evidence. But 2, we outweigh really clearly with the hundreds of thousands of lives on probability and scope anyway. So if you're looking at the weighing, it's really clear. Then on military, they go for United States. They drop the defense MAC puts on their case. It says that Congress doesn't support this, and at worst, it would last 30 days. But even more, if you want to do the weighing, it's really clear. The LA Times does the weighing for you. They say that sanctions in Iraq killed 30,000 people. Sorry, the war in Iraq killed 30,000 people, but sanctions killed 500,000 people. It's really clear that sanctions always are going to kill more people because they hurt the people more than war does, because war involves like I don't know. This happens. Alright, sorry man. Let's go to their our case. Here's a few really important things. So they try to extend this turnabout Maduro being like entrenched in power, being ousted from power because of the military. They really dropped the key response that Mac meets from Sturna. It says that the military is ideologically aligned with Maduro. This is so important because if Maduro is ousted and the military takes its place, his policies will continue. They never gain access to any of their impacts in the round. They never have any solvency on probability. It's super clear because they clearly conceded this throughout the round. Bad policy continues. And then the other time on Sicko, they say that Sicko is like going to have to pay Russia back a whole bunch of debt. They drop the responses Mac gives you as well. That one, this protection ended 90 days after. It literally doesn't matter right now. But second, the PDV. If we lift sanctions, we save the oil industry because we are making enough money to pay back this debt anyway. So at that point, we are still at the biggest risk of solvency on probability of winning first debt. But either way, we say they never interact with the link evidence that $18 billion is directly going to be injected into the economy. Even if they don't make any revenue, it's still direct $18 billion coming right back from the US assets where it's frozen in America, right back to the people. It's important. Our Tyler links don't get touched. One on food and medicine because Razback tells you that oil revenues are paid for food, which gives right to the people in the form of aid, but second, the hard currency because 95% of Venezuelan exports fuel the economy in that way. And then on famine because Heinz 90 tells you that hundreds of thousands of people are going to die if we do not link sanctions. Then the urgency, this outweighs really cleanly.
Alright, ready?
Yeah.
What incentive does Maduro have to diversify pre-sanctions?
Yeah, so your own link evidence says the reason that sanctions caused him to diversify is because they hurt the oil industry. You also tell me he was hurting the oil industry. That means eventually, because he was already hurting the oil industry, he was going to eventually be forced to diversify.
So
because that is your own link.
So the difference between our two worlds is that Maduro can always physically or logically double down on
this
oil.
been the summary?
It was in summary.
No,
that
it
was my
wasn't.
warranting. So he physically couldn't do it now. He had the
Why?
option because he doesn't have access to international payment
Dude,
systems.
your internal
which means
link
he
is
can't
literally
export
that the oil gets hurt.
No, that's our uniqueness. Our internal
No,
link is that
but it's
Maduro
your link
can't
evidence.
diversify.
It is your link evidence. Your evidence for why sanctions cause him to diversify says the reason why is because they hurt the oil industry. Insofar as you also tell us the industry was already being hurt, that triggers your only link in the evidence.
The link isn't decreasing revenue.
That's
the
your link
is blocked
evidence.
off from international markets. So
No,
Maduro
it's your
can't
evidence.
diversify. He like has no
Literally-
incentive to.
Okay, so-
he siphons money from like nationalized oil companies.
Wait, it's not
There's
about
no-
an
this is all new,
incentive.
right?
It's
This is all
literally
new.
not about an incentive, right?
Then why
we
would
say
he do
that.
it pre-sanctions or
Yeah,
post-sanctions?
because they have to, because the oil industry is being crippled by
It's
Maduro's
still your
bad
link.
policy.
It was
It's your
crippled
own
before his
link
bad
right
policy
here.
before sanctions too.
That's our point, right?
Yes.
It was crippled by his bad policy, triggering
But he
the link in
continued
your
to
evidence.
pass bad policy. Like he doesn't care.
What?
He
Yeah,
only
but
wants
we
to see his
say-
corruption
Sure,
order.
but
So first of all, this is all new. It's
Yeah.
all new in
Anyway,
Grand Cross.
anyway.
Second of all, we would say that even if you want to evaluate, right, we're still right on this point because what we say is that their evidence, the only reason sanctions calls them to diversify is because they hurt the oil industry. If he himself was already hurting the oil industry, that triggers the
you
very
can ask
same
us a
link.
question if you want.
That was my question.
Wait, like, okay,
It
you
forces
ask
him to
another one?
diversify.
Do
It
you
would
want to ask a
eventually.
question?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's talk about U.S. intervention.
Aye.
Right? How probable do you think this is?
Pretty high. So like the defense that you read is that like there's a 30-day time period and then Congress doesn't agree with it.
Yeah.
But for Congress to be like cemented that they don't agree with it, some bad impact would have to happen. So at the end of the day, we still garner offense off of it
Wait.
because some negative impact is triggered for Congress to recall troops. But 30
Okay.
days is like a month. That's a large amount of time for Venezuela to deploy troops and then for like to start conflict.
Hold
Like,
on. So your impact scenario is it would be like the Vietnam War. How long
Correct.
did the Vietnam War last?
like,
Very much longer
for
than
maximum
30
damage,
days,
sure,
right?
it
Like
would be like
30
the Vietnam
days is
War.
not going to kill hundreds of thousands of people.
I
Like,
just have a really quick question.
I mean, you could with bombings.
I have a
like
really
really,
quick
like you
question.
could in 5 seconds.
If
Go
you
ahead.
hypothetically win dollarization, doesn't that mean the United States is more likely to go to war? So it kind of prereqs that, right?
Why?
Because I
Diversification.
kind of feel. Sorry,
Just
I
because
meant
you peg your economy to
diversification.
the dollar doesn't make the U.S. like you.
No, I meant diversification, right? Like if
I
Maduro's
still
economy
don't
gets
understand.
stronger, don't they feel threatened and like want to go to war with him?
So Maduro would go to war with the U.S.
no.
No,
Why?
I
It
mean
triggers
other way
the
around.
scenario.
What are you?
It triggers your scenario. I mean.
If they diversify, Maduro loses power because he can't siphon as much money from PDVSA, which would
Okay.
decrease his
I
power.
see military is aligned with. the-
Yes.
Yeah.
Drone and
Yeah.
bolsters.
Let me just get the highlight. Okay, it's this paragraph.
Hi.
That's fine. Alright, that's fine.
Hi.
Would it cool if I sit down?
Fine with us.
So it's going to be on their case, mostly. That on our case. The reason why we win the round is because we're winning our Maduro advantage. The problem is that their only response is that the military is ideologically aligned with Maduro. The problem is that their evidence is pre-sanctions and it's from 2016. Our evidence is from September of 2019 and says that the military is currently abandoning Maduro because the only reason why they were aligned with him in the first place is because he was the only one who was corrupt enough to pay them off. And that's very critical because our TN evidence tells you that the military is the one in Venezuela who decides who is in power. That's why our Brown evidence tells you that because of the lack of revenues, that is going to cause the restoration of democracy because Maduro will no longer have anyone backing him. The reason why we win is because this solves for their case. They concede our Morales evidence that says that the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela was started because Maduro began cutting social programs before sanctions. Their evidence about famine is specific to oil funding those social programs at the point where Maduro was not funding these social programs even before sanctions. It does not matter if you lift them or not. Maduro is never going to fund them. The only way that social programs actually come into effect is if Maduro is gone. The only way that happens is if you vote nay. Now, we're also going to go for Citgo. The only thing that they respond is that the protections are gone. The problem is that our evidence is from October. The 90 days is no longer up. That's very critical because you're going to extend our evidence, which tells you that absent those sanctions, Russia would have taken over Citgo, which is very problematic because our Lindenberg evidence tells you that Russia would gain control over the U.S. oil sector and be able to spike our oil prices, causing a recession. And that's why our IMF evidence tells you that the next recession would push 900 million people into poverty from a recession. That's going to outweigh all of their impacts on magnitude. Now, on our case, we're going to go for intervention pretty quickly. Extend our Acts evidence, which tells you that Trump is using sanctions instead of military intervention, and past our drop evidence, which tells you that Trump wants to retain a hardline stance on Venezuela to win Florida, and that's why our Hines evidence tells you that a U.S. intervention would pull in regional actors, killing 4 million. The problem is that even if they win, that the military intervention is very short term. At the point where it pulls in regional actors, we're going to be stuck in the war, which means that we're going to have to stay there, and it's going to end up killing 4 million people. That's why we're winning.
I think we have a bit of prep left, like 20 seconds.
We should have about a minute actually.
Okay.
Just under a minute. So we'll take that now.
Can you find me Is it interview? Doesn't. That's fine, but also it doesn't matter if you're because we know all the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
And if we are so any difference is going to trigger half of thing. The military thing, I think it doesn't really matter because they're not even going for supremacy on like the economy thing because like it's such an important like it doesn't. They never extend anything since the economy is back because of majority. Yeah.
Okay, that's our prep. So it's going to be all of their offense, starting with intervention, going through their turns, and then extending our case. I'll sign most people. Okay. The only case offense they go for is U.S. intervention. They drop my defensive response to the SME extension summary. They only respond to it in final focus. What we say is that Congress won't let him intervene according to Quang 19. They don't support it. But even if he does intervene, even if he doesn't manage to intervene, they drop the evidence from Lord 20 that would only last for 30 days. That completely takes out all of their time frame. They have no probability because Congress won't let them, but they also have no time frame. It would only last 30 days. They don't get access to any of their impact scenario. Even if they had extended it, which they didn't, they don't get access to it because it's about the Vietnam War. It's not about Venezuela. 30 days is not going to cause any of this damage. But even if you do buy that, we still away a magnitude because sanctions cause 500,000 deaths. In Iraq, whilst the war only cost 30,000, sanctions just cause more deaths. But then, on our case, what we tell they tell you this turn that they're going to oust Maduro. But first of all, they have no probability here because the military is still loyal to Maduro. They do a faulty extension of this in summary. They have no impact, no weighing on this whatsoever until it is extended in summary. But also, they drop the Stronin analysis. They completely drop it throughout this entire round. Even if the military takes over from Maduro, they're just going to continue his policies. They say that they make this new response to final focus. This is an old piece of evidence. They never tell you why that matters. Their evidence does not say anything about the military's ideological stance. They just say the military is turning against Maduro. They're still ideologically aligned with him, which means they'll continue his policies. He'll just be Maduro by another name. They get no impacts. But then on their turn about Citgo, they don't get access to it because they never respond to our responses in their summary. Even if they respond in final focus, it's too late. But the only response they say is that their evidence is from October. Our evidence says that these protections started on August 6th, and they already ended after 90 days. But also they drop the other piece of analysis that ESME extends, that the only reason that PDVs would ever be at risk of defaulting on Citgo is because we have sanctions on them. They concede our links. That Taylor admits that if we unblock sanctions, Citgo profit 18 billion immediately is funded into the oil industry, and they get to make a long-term profit. That triggers our internal links that they've conceded throughout this entire round. Only responses in final focus. We say that Resurrect 18 fights that oil revenues have historically been used to pay for food, and that they're used for 99% of the economy and all of the food imports as well. That triggers our Hines 19 evidence. They never contest. It says the famine will break out, killing hundreds of thousands of people unless we lift sanctions. That outweighs everything else because poverty doesn't matter if people are dead.